David Simmons.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. All of us in this House who are parents or have young children among our family and friends will know that there is an abundance of advice available on the topic of today's debate. And many of us will take that advice. We talk to our babies in the womb, we play games with them before they're born, we study baby-led weaning, and indeed we invest in stain-proof covers that never seem to extend quite far enough. But wherever on the nurturing scale we sit as mums and dads, being surrounded by adults taking an active interest means that the babies involved thrive. The focus of my contribution today is going to be those babies and young children who need extra help to thrive, those whose interests are at the heart of the decision by government to invest in family hubs in the recent budget, as championed by my honourable friend, the member for South Northamptonshire. And it is very welcome, as many members have said, that this agenda is taking a higher and higher profile in the context of levelling up, because we all recognise the need to build on sound foundations. 20 years' experience in the world of children's services has taught me a lot about the strengths and the weaknesses of the child supporting system that we have in our country. Like our NHS, we are very good at emergency services, and studies by academics at the universities of Bristol and Warwick show that the UK has a world-leading child protection system. But today's debate, Madam Deputy Speaker, goes beyond protection from harm and into how we help children to thrive and to flourish, something which is not just a matter of social responsibility, but as the member for South Northamptonshire has highlighted, also long-term economic benefit to our country. Thriving children live lives that cost the taxpayer less, and they contribute more to everyone's benefit. So to this end, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm going to offer 3 points which are focused on how we turn the widely shared aspiration that we hear in the Chamber today. And I say to the honourable member for Pontypridd, I grew up in her village. I'm glad to hear of the progress that it is making. But how we turn that shared aspiration into a change which those children and their families can see and feel in their lives. So firstly, Madam Deputy Speaker, we need to follow the flow of money. The funding for early years, which is a key statutory responsibility for all of our local authorities, does remain mired in bureaucratic processes which are dominated by those whose focus, for good reasons, is elsewhere. The schools' forums, which determine the distribution of the dedicated schools grant in which much of this funding sits, are dominated by the interests of our secondary schools, and a fragmented earlier sector of small private, voluntary, charitable providers often struggles to be heard. So this is a structure around the money which inhibits the innovation and flexibility and stands in the way of creating the joined-up local offer which the member for Shoreham and Easton Worthing highlighted in his contribution earlier on. So whilst I can see that there is a perceived political benefit to lumping that early years funding in with schools, in reality the needs of these sectors are different. So, my pleasure.
I'm listening very carefully to what the Honourable said about ring fence. I don't disagree with him. But that's why Sure Start funding was directed through local authorities and ring-fenced at local level for local authorities to draw up the local strategies. And what he talks about levelling up, but didn't start this process in 2019. We've seen devastation, certainly in County Durham, of Sure Start centres because of cuts of funding which his government, and who else wasn't in the House then, took to that funding.
Well, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think it's very good to hear the contribution from the honourable member. Having been in a local authority throughout the period of the implementation of Sure Start, I think whilst it was welcome to see a government giving a high degree of priority to children in the earliest years of their lives, there were a number of failings with that programme. One was that the pace at which government sought to deliver it, for understandable reasons of political priority, meant that poor decisions were often made both about the location of services and exactly what was delivered. And at a time when there were many other areas outside of Sure Start that were a very high priority for local areas, we saw a situation where Sure Start was generously funded to meet that aspiration, and other activities like child protection were starved of cash. So I think it is absolutely the case that whilst all governments have a view that they wish to see their particular priorities delivered, we need to look at what we do to achieve a longer-term consensus about what's in the interests of children in the earliest years of their lives. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, what I'm calling on ministers to consider is how we free the early years sector from the shackles imposed by the dedicated schools grant and bring it together with those other local authority and NHS budgets so that investment can be aligned with the needs of local families and build on the strengths of the early years sector, which we must not forget is not just about nurseries. It's an opportunity to join up with a range of local statutory services and non-statutory ones, which include health visiting, childminding, family hubs, child protection, public health, vaccination services, libraries, play and informal learning. And I can certainly say when I was a very new parent, the services provided by the libraries of the London Borough of Hillingdon with story time for very young children were a really outstanding example of that early support, the chance to meet other parents whose children were at the same stage, to get informal advice, to get tips, which is exactly the kind of thing that sits maybe outside of what government often mandates, but which is treasured by parents of very young children. So having touched on the funding challenge, we need to ensure that every area has the scope to develop a strategy for thriving that suits local circumstances. Now, many of our councils, the 152 top-tier authorities, are in partnership arrangements of one kind or another. Some are council to council, others reflect outsourced services. But all of that reflects issues of local need and capacity. So as well as the statutory lead member for children's services, the director of children's services, the Health and Wellbeing Board, all of these have the most scope to join up the offer to get babies the best start in life. And these boards, which are statutory committees of the local authority, can still often struggle, Madam Deputy Speaker, to assert their role, especially with the NHS, which in my experience is strategically disengaged despite their role as key partners. And the rearguard action that was fought by the NHS against making public health a local and accountable service has also inhibited innovation and tied up resources in rolled over NHS contracts, rather than stimulated the reshaping of local services around children. Now, I've seen some outstanding examples of that reshaping as well. I would pay tribute to my constituent, Dr. Jide Menakaya, who's a leading paediatrician who's led work across the sector in his field of neonatal care in the London Borough of Hillingdon, through children's centres, through Sure Start, to join those services up so mums and dads have a seamless experience. However, the system still tends to stand in the way, Madam Deputy Speaker, of creativity rather than promoting it. So my suggestion to the front bench is that we look in line with previous asks of our health and wellbeing boards to produce, for example, joint strategies on child mental health, at setting a clear expectation for them on a strategy for helping children to thrive in line with the first 1001 days ambitions, much of which already exists in different forms at a local level. But for a new parent or an expectant family, it can feel very hard to access, very fragmented, and driven by disparate duties and funding regimes imposed by government. So in line, for example, with the local offer for children with special educational needs and disabilities, a strategic approach to the local offer for the earliest years will deliver greater value for money and vitally greater coherence for parents accessing it. The final area, Madam Deputy Speaker, that I'd like to put forward for consideration is accountability. And successive governments have adjusted the regulatory environment for the early years. But broadly speaking, the two priorities today are school readiness, which is seen in the regulation of settings such as childminding and nurseries, and the avoidance of harm to children, which is seen in the regulation of child protection and the NHS. In a context where resources are extremely stretched, not just money, but as we've heard from a number of honourable members, the workforce too. This tends to drive a risk-averse approach in the early years. That's prioritising the absence of failure rather than the promotion of innovation. So we need to consider, Madam Deputy Speaker, how we line up the accountability that we've all talked about with what we're seeking to achieve for our children. So my suggestion to ministers is that we need to look beyond the current inspection regimes and data sets, many strengths though they have, that are used for performance management, and to think about how we measure the things that are involved in a child thriving, the positive health and social outcomes that we want for babies in our country and how we incentivise the behaviour that will deliver them. Now, time is tight, Madam Deputy Speaker, so I'll simply mention in conclusion, we have so many statutory duties in place that will help us to deliver this, but so often the holders of those duties lack the autonomy needed to fulfil the aspirations that we have. So we need a permissive approach from government. And in conclusion, much of what we do, we need to recognise is world class, of the highest quality, as many parents of young children, including myself, can attest. But the regulatory regime still expects too often low standards. So rather than contributing to success, we have a complex funding system that stands in the way of local communities and their leaders delivering value for money and good outcomes for every child. We all want to give our babies the very best start in life. Madam Deputy Speaker, by enabling local leadership, setting high standards and setting people free to innovate, we give ourselves the best chance of levelling up life chances for all of our children.